This session, I really want to talk about systems, the word system thinking. What does that mean? Rather than food systems. So I want to take you back a little bit and understand, explain to you the thinking that at least we had when we were developing our work on food systems over the past 3 years. And this work was done as a collaboration between kids based in Amsterdam and Wageningen University and Research. So yeah, systems is sort of the key word, but there's also a lot of confusion about what do we mean with system thinking, what is a system approach, what is a system in itself. So for today, yeah, here we are, sorry. Basically, I have 4 sections in my presentation. Why do we need systems thinking when we talk about food systems, when we try to understand food systems, or when we look for solutions to problems that we want to solve? What are actually different forms of system thinking? Because there are different approaches. And then I'll say a few words about system behavior. And then finally, I want to say a bit about a toolbox we developed over the past years, that with the aim of that toolbox is also to help people, whether it's an NGO or a policymaker, even researchers. So many of you who are in this virtual room, where you find different methods and tools you can use to do a food system analysis. And it's not just, the purpose is not to do the analysis in itself. Of course, it's an important step, but to do an analysis that will help you to then formulate actions for change, that will help you to formulate policies or programs, interventions in a food system that can help you to achieve change that you want to see. And I think these documents, the toolbox has been shared with you. It's being made available to you at the moment. We only have an English and a Spanish version. Hopefully in the future, there will be a French version as well. But that is for you to be inspired, to use as you wish. It's an open resource. So why do we need systems thinking when we look at food systems, when we talk about food system analysis? Well, basically, we are dealing with complex problems. And complex problems, yes, you can always think of a solution that is simple, but often it's wrong because it does not take into account all the drivers, all the other elements of a system that are moving, that are changing as you intervene. So we need to think about the system. We need to look at a broader picture. And I think many of you are here because you also realize that, well, it's more and more said our food systems are broken. That's often the phrase that has been used. Because we have to deal with issues like poverty and hunger, climate change, the current pandemic, and so on. Many of these issues that you're very familiar with. And there's at international level also, as well as local level, there's an increase in the debate and discussions like what is broken and what needs to be fixed and how should we fix this. But it's clear, I think, to most people that business as usual is not an option. If you continue as we have been doing things over the past 40 years, we all see that the problems are just increasing. So that calls for drastic change, that calls for disruptive change, because if we talk about transformation of a food system, we talk about disruption, we talk about doing something completely different, not just continuing on the current practices that we do. So why system thinking? Now, another step back, I just want to explain to you that there are different problems that we're facing. And we can distinguish difficult problems from wicked problems. And a wicked problem, I just want to explain to you the difference between these two types of problems and why that requires a different approach in solving it. So if we talk about a complicated problem or a difficult problem, that's often characterized by the priorities are clear. There are a number of solutions, but it's a limited number of solutions that are known. The problem can be treated as a standalone matter. because there are a limited number of people involved. And we know we have the knowledge, we have the information on how to address that problem. A wicked problem is where even the priorities of what is the problem or what should be solved is called into question by different people. There may not be obvious solutions available, or the problem in itself is really intertwined with the context. And there are many people involved who maybe don't even agree on what the problem is. What is more urgent? Is it climate change? Is it food security? Is it the economic crisis? Is it the health crisis that we are all in at the moment? So there's a lot of debate around this, and there are no obvious solutions. Just as an example, maybe for now, we are all affected by this global pandemic with COVID-19 that's already ongoing for more than a year. So how to treat illnesses or how to manage the virus, making the vaccine, you could say, that's a difficult problem. The researchers did not yet have all the knowledge, but they sort of knew where to start, what to prioritize in developing a vaccine. And they used existing knowledge on other viruses to develop a new vaccine for COVID-19. So that's a difficult, complicated problem, but we have the capacities, we have the skills, the knowledge to solve it. A wicked problem could be, how do we roll out a worldwide vaccine program? Then it becomes more complex because we have to deal with infrastructure to provide vaccines. We have to look at production, where is it being produced, who can buy it, who has access. We have to set up campaigns to convince people that they take a vaccine. So it becomes more and more wicked problem, the vaccine program. Another example could be if we look at malnutrition, fortification of food products, so to make sure that there's more nutrients available in a particular food product, for example, whether it's vitamin A or some other nutrients. We can consider that as a complicated, a difficult problem. We have the skills and again, the knowledge to do this. But if we talk about how do we address the double burden of malnutrition worldwide, where we have obesity, but also hunger, that becomes a complex problem because again, we have to deal with communities, with policies, with people. It becomes very difficult. So that's a difference between a difficult problem and a wicked problem. So I hope that's clear to you. And one of the things that makes part of a wicked problem is what they call emergence. Now, this may be a concept that you have not heard before, but I'm sure when I explain it to you, you will understand it. Emergence really talks about the change that happens or that's caused by small actions from people. And these are often non-linear processes. So what in the emergence theory they say, well, normally in a system we have rules that describe the regularities that determine relationship in a system. So if you think about a food system, it's, for example, the enabling context. We have certain structures in place that define the trade flows. There are policies in place, there are regulations in place about food safety, for example. But within that enabling context, within those rules, we also have to deal with what they call causal agencies. Basically, we have people, actors, you and me, consumers, producers, traders, researchers, NGOs, policymakers, civil society, who act within that system, you could say, who have their own attitudes, their own beliefs, their own behavior, their own practices and the daily decisions that they make that also shape that system. So these are the two elements, and maybe a good way to explain it, if you think of the game of chess, it's I think all of you know, within chess you have a set of rules. Each piece has a certain rule of how you can move it across the board. But even if you know all the rules of the game, you cannot predict the course of the game. You cannot predict beforehand who will be the winner and who will be the loser. Because once the game starts, the game involves more than the rules. It also involves moment by moment decisions of the players and how they act and react to each other. So a food system can be seen in the same way, that you have day-to-day decisions of many actors. And so that's where system thinking comes in, to understand what are the rules, what are the drivers, but also what are patterns of behaviors, whether that's behavior at individual level or behavior at group level. And what are then the opportunities for change if you look at that dynamic picture. So systems thinking helps you to look at this concept of emergence and understand it in a different way. What for me was very helpful, I won't explain this graph in detail, but the Helena Framework, you can look it up on the internet. There's a lot more information on that. It's developed by Snowden. That really distinguishes what are different types of problems. Is it complex, complicated, and what is the way to deal with it? So this is sort of summarizing what I try to explain to you, the different types of problems and the different types of analysis and approaches you need to address problems. But I hope you will agree with me that a food system is a wicked problem. Because the many problems that we're facing today, the climate change, malnutrition, biodiversity loss, they're all linked together. We cannot disentangle them from each other, and we cannot disentangle it from the context within which it happens, whether that's in Nigeria, in a country, at country national level, or worldwide, or very local. And also, we are all very much aware of these problems and possible solutions. They evolve on long timescales. And there are many people are involved. And even if we come up with solutions and interventions in our own day-to-day work, as soon as we intervene, the wider system will respond to that, positively or negatively. And I'll say a bit more about that later. So another basic question, but important to talk about, what does systems thinking actually mean? The word systems thinking, what do we mean with that? And I think in a way, most people are born as systems thinkers. If you just think about your day-to-day decisions, what to eat, what to do in your leisure time. There are many factors we take into consideration when we make such a decision. And we are sort of systems thinkers in that way. And a farmer who has to decide which crop to grow, when to plant, what to sell, how much to sell, to whom to sell, also has many factors to take into account. So a farmer is also a typical systems thinker. The thing is that often in our scientific thinking, in our education systems, we learn to think really to compartmentalize, so to say, the problems and to think about singular solutions. That's sort of how we've been trained in our own educational backgrounds. And we specialize just in one small component of that larger food system. So that is where there's sometimes a mismatch when we think of solutions. Now, there's systems thinking and there's systems thinking. And it really depends whether you are educated in a more natural sciences background or social sciences background. Because in the natural sciences, now this is generalizing it a bit, putting it black and white, but in the natural sciences, system is often seen as a noun. The system is something that exists out in the world. An ecosystem exists out in the world. A forest is a system that you can observe that exists out in the world. And so that's often referred to as hard systems thinking in the natural sciences, where they say, well, the problem, it's system determined. And if you talk about an ecosystem collapse or deforestation, the focus is on the description of that system, of the system components. And the problem is really considered as complicated. In the social sciences, it's more seen as an adjective. The system is an adjective. It's more, the term is more used to express a way of thinking about things. And it's often referred to as soft systems thinking. And here, it's considered as a problem-determined system. So rather than saying this is an ecosystem, a forest that we can observe as an outsider, they say, no, we have a problem, but it's the social system around it that defines the problem, but also where we can find solutions through multi-stakeholder collaborations. So if there is a shared problem, whether it's malnutrition or it could be a mismatch between demand and supply in a specific value chain, yeah, there are stakeholders involved, actors involved, and through collaboration, if we bring that social system together, we can better understand the problem together and then identify solutions together. So in soft systems, and it's more systems, a system is seen as complex, complicated, complex and wicked. I'm telling you this because often I see some confusion when we work together on projects and we have people from different disciplines. There's sometimes some confusion about what do we mean with system thinking. So be aware of that, that we sometimes use the same words, but we may have different meanings to that. Another thinking model that's really useful for me, at least, is the Iceberg Model, which you may have seen. Again, it comes from a different scientific background. This really comes from complexity thinking, systems thinking in general. And this model distinguishes 4 levels. It says, basically, a system, you can subdivide it into 4 levels. You have the events, the things, the symptoms, the things that you can observe. We can observe changing weather patterns, for example. We can observe an increase in average temperatures in many of the climates around the world. We can observe an increase or a decline in numbers of people who are malnourished. So these are things we can measure. These are things we can observe. What is happening? And we can react to those things. If we see there is a drought somewhere and there's a shortage of food, we react by providing emergency aid, for example. But underneath, there are patterns, there are trends that tell us something about where we come from and which way we are going. So a lot of the climate debate is also about the trends, not just the day-to-day weather forecast, but what has been the trend over time when it comes to temperatures, rainfall, and so on. But if we go a bit deeper, and this is all underneath the surface, these are things we cannot easily observe, that we cannot easily see, but as we dig a bit deeper, there are structures underneath. And the system structures really reveal patterns or components, how they relate to each other and how they affect each other. So this is to do with the design of a system. And at the bottom, it's the mental models. It's really to do with our thinking that allows the situation to persist. A mental model reflects our beliefs, our values, our assumptions that we personally hold. Sometimes we cannot even explain them, but each one of us, we're influenced by that. And you could say at global level, also there are mental models out there. For example, the economy that we have at the moment, the neoliberal policies that exist certainly in Europe. These are sort of mental models at society level, how we believe an economy should be designed, what should be our rules when we talk about global trade, when we talk about climate change, how to address that. And these are very difficult to change, mental models, because it goes really deep in our mindsets. But if you really want to transform a system, if you can change a mental model, the rest will follow. That's the thinking, that's the theory. But the deeper you go in this iceberg, the more difficult it becomes to change things, certainly at short-term timelines. Lastly, I want to say a few words about system behavior, and this is more a bit of a peek into the theory of system dynamics. And this you will also, I don't know if you have read our report, our food system analysis of Nigeria, but we also looked at system behavior. The basic of system dynamics, the basic assumption you could say is that they say any system contains feedback mechanisms. So again, a system could be a society, it could be an organization, it could be a forest, an ecosystem, it could be a value chain. But everywhere, if you really use this as a lens, you will find there are feedback mechanisms that either result in a reinforcing or a balancing process. What do I mean with that? So a balancing process is where you have two things that react to each other to keep a certain status quo. So in markets, if you are a bit familiar with economic theory on markets, there's a supply and a demand that keeps each other sort of in balance. If there's an increasing demand for a particular product, then supply will also increase, and the price mechanism will also make sure there's a sort of, if there are no huge problems, that's in balance, supply and demand, whether it's for rice or tomatoes. But a reinforcing loop is where you have maybe two factors, two events. They also react to each other, but you get an exponential growth or decline if it's not checked by some policy or some other factor from outside. And those reinforcing loops, they can move towards a tipping point. So this, if you have a bit of a background in ecology or ecosystems, you will recognize this from those theories. But there are many feedback loops in a system, and they run at different time scales and they run at different spatial scales. So it becomes very complex to understand how a system is behaving to understand all those feedback loops. But system dynamics is really looking at what are causal factors, how do they react to each other, and is it reinforcing or is it a balancing process? The other thing that I want to briefly mention is that in system dynamics, they then also talk about archetypes. And archetypes are basically types of behavior that you see in a system that is very common. Now, this is a very theoretical, also the words on the slide, but I just want to explain to you two archetypes, and that may help you say, oh yeah, maybe I know this. I recognize this type of system behavior. And in our toolbox, in that document, you will find 8 different archetypes that we often see in food systems that can cause problems or that need to change to really come to solutions. So you will find more information on this in the toolbox if you're interested. One archetype is fixes that fail. And basically, it means it's a short-term fix for a long-term problem. And there is a quick fix that may enable, that may address the symptom or the event if you think of the Iceberg model, but it doesn't really address the underlying problem. And over time, there's no solution. So we have a symptom, we have a problem. In the case of Nigeria, for example, Nigeria is a food importing country, whereas Nigeria in itself has a lot of potential for food production. But yeah, there's a deficit of food being produced in country, you could say. So the quick fix is to import cheap foods from other countries through Lagos, through the port, and then make sure that the urban population has enough food. But the real problem is that the country is very much reliant on the oil sector, but the foreign exchange, so to say, that they earn with the oil exports is used to buy that food from outside rather than to invest in the agricultural sector to increase productivity in country and to increase food production within Nigeria, where though there is a lot of potential, there's not they don't invest the resources that are necessary. So you in the long term, basically, you keep that problem of not sufficient food production in country. So that's a fix that fails, addressing the short-term problem, but not addressing the long-term issue. Tragedy of the commons, I think many of you are familiar also with, and this is also what we often see, where there's a common resource. This could be grazing land, this could be common forest, but also if you think about common resources such as water or the climate in itself even, our individual behavior and the use of the resource, we use it for our private benefits, but there's no investment in the management of the common resource. So if we combine all our individual uses, the aggregated use exceeds the capacity of the common resource. So I use, maybe I book a flight. This is not a good example because we don't fly anymore. I may use my car to drive to work. My CO2 emission is quite small with my small car. I don't drive a large distance, but if you do that as well, and another one does that as well, just aggregating the car usage of all of us, then it results in a high CO2 emission, which of course affects the climate. So the total activity of our use of that common resource negatively affects the common resource. So over time, the individual gain that we get from our activity will decline, and then the initial response will be to increase our activity so we get more gain, but eventually we are exceeding the resource limits and the whole system will collapse. I can see I'm going over my time, but I want to say a few things about the toolbox also, if I'm allowed.
Please do, Helena. Yeah.
Thanks. So I mentioned this already. I would love you to have a look at the toolbox to think, can I use it in my work and my food system analysis? Feel free to use it, feel free to share it. It's really meant to inspire you when you think about the food system analysis. What we've done in the toolbox is that we split it up in 5 components. And the first one is really to help you think about what is the objective of my analysis? How can I put boundaries on the food system? Do I look at national level, local level, global level? And then there are 3 components that make part of the food system analysis. And basically, one part we think is very important is to look at the system actors. Who are the stakeholders? What is the political economy, the governance of the system? To look at the second part is to look at system characteristics. So this is really looking at the symptoms, the events, the trends that we know, whether that's prices, food security, environmental outcomes, and so on. And thirdly is to look at the system behavior. So how is that food system behaving? What are the causalities? What are the causal relationships? Can we identify any archetypes maybe in that system? So these common types of behavior that need to change, that need to transform. And if so, how can we transform those types of behavior? So where can we find leverage points to induce transformation, to disrupt some of those causalities, basically? And then finally, the last part of that toolbox is about how do we now move from analysis to action? And it gives you some suggestions, some tools, some methods, some questions to consider to use the insights from your analysis to formulate actions. There are 3 quality principles that we believe are important if you do food system analysis. 1, please use systems thinking. I'm making a strong plea for systems thinking today. And consider sort of, so what are the patterns, what are the structures underneath? Because if we talk about transformation of food systems, we really need to go deeper and think about what is the design, what do we need to change to get different outcomes. Our second quality principle is that we cannot do this by ourselves. one researcher or even a researcher team cannot do a food system analysis. We really need to do this by involving stakeholders right from the start, throughout the entire analysis until the end when we formulate action. We really want to say, yeah, we need a diversity of voices at the table for the discussion. Because the more perspectives you have, the more chance you have that you find new innovative solutions. And also to create ownership among stakeholders to really jointly work together and identify actions. This does require a good facilitation for that process, because there's always first a difficulty of finding common language. There's first a divergence of ideas before you come to convergence of ideas and solutions. But I just want to plug in the MSP guides. There's a link on my slide where you can find also many methods and tools to think through how can I involve stakeholders in such a process. And thirdly, yeah, we really think it's important to think about issues like equity and inclusion. So throughout the process, even when you start inviting actors, stakeholders to the table, but also during the analysis, ask yourself the questions: who has access to the resources? Who has access to education? Who has the decision-making power? Who benefits and who is losing? Are there differences across social markers such as gender, age, migrants, and so on? And maybe just equality, equity, these are also concepts often used, but what does it mean? This picture is really a nice illustration. If you talk about equality, every single actor gets the same resource, for example. So we have a father with 2 young children watching a game, they get the same box. The father and the older son can now see the game, but the youngest is still, the resource given is not enough for him to be able to participate in sort of watching the game. So equity means that, okay, for all to have the same benefit of watching the game, some need more resources than others. Some need some more help than others to achieve equity. So now the youngest son has 2 boxes, so he can also watch the game. But by removing the fence, we will get real liberation. Then everyone with their own capacity as they are has the same benefit, which would of course be the ideal, but also difficult to achieve. But in reality, what we often see is that there are a few who are really ahead of the others, who also have most resources, who also can easily access more resources and have more benefits than the marginalized. So yeah, keep this in the back of your mind when you think about actions and think about what to do next. So how do we go from analysis to actions? We really try to look for leverage points that can make change happen. And that's if you have a little bit of understanding of that system behavior, looking for the points where with a relatively small intervention or investment, you could have a large effect on the system behavior. That's the thinking. Another way to look at it, again, I don't have enough time to explain this in detail, but you'll find more information in Toolbox, is to map what is currently, this is called the free horizon model. What is in our current Horizon 1 model? What are the trends? What if we continue with business as usual? Where are we heading? And from that, what do we want to keep? What is valuable to keep? But also, what do we want to change? Then you can also draw up with your stakeholders a long-term vision. Horizon 3 is where do we want to head towards to? What's our long-term vision? And where do we want to be in the future? And if you compare those two, then look at, this is called Horizon 2. What are maybe even currently pockets of innovation that we can already find that will help us to move from the current first horizon to the long-term vision? And have a discussion around that. And then finally, when deciding on interventions, so that's a combination again of, okay, so if we look at the system in itself, what could be leverage points of change? What could be innovations that really take us closer to that long-term vision that we have? But of course, you also need to look at yourself. What are my skills? What is my capacity? What is my mandate? What can I do? What mechanisms of influence do I have, or the partners that I work with, to trigger a change somewhere? And there might also be, you may also have to look, it depends whether this is relevant for you or not, whether you're a policymaker or an NGO, but you may have some specific policy objectives. So it's a combination of those three considerations that will help you to then prioritize the intervention areas, depending on what will bring about change, what are your own capacities and mandates, what is your own objective within that larger playfield. That is it. And I know I've gone over time. I'm really sorry, but I'll stop here.